Hello everybody and welcome to the GMS Magazine channel. This is the RPG interview room and I am Paco Garcia, your host. This is the show in which I am lucky enough to get together with people from the world of role-playing games so I can talk to them about, well, anything related to role-playing games and bring it all to you. If you are watching the video in our YouTube channel, please know that there is a podcast version that you can take anywhere. And if you're listening to the podcast, please know that there is a YouTube video version of this that, well, you can see me and my guests chatting. Either way, please remember to subscribe and leave us some feedback, which is always very, very welcome indeed. Disclaimer, this is the second time that I have to interview my guest because the first time we had a bit of an issue with sound and it didn't record, so it was kind of like useless and it didn't work out. So yeah, for transparency's sake, this is the second time that this interview takes place. And also, as you can see, I'm still not in the studio. It is the end of April 2020, and we are still in lockdown because of the coronavirus that's going on around, and I hope that you're keeping safe. Right, talking about safety, the person I have with me today is Brie Beau Sheldon. Beau's been working on safety tools for role-playing games for a very, very long time out of the necessity of getting something else than the X card. But not just from the point of view of what to put on the table, but also how to make us geek culture and role-playing game culture a bit safer for people who actually need that kind of safety. Well, you know, for everybody, come on. Everyone. I know what some of you are going to say, that, you know, we don't need safety tools. Look, just please watch the video or listen to the podcast, because this interview, what Beau has to say is not exactly what you might have heard in the past. And the safety tool that he's designed, the script change, actually changes an awful lot of conceptions and preconceptions about safety tools. Trust me on this one. I think this is different. This is way, way different, and to me a lot better. So anyway, I won't take any longer of your time. Please listen, watch the interview, and let me know what you think. I'll see you on the other side. Beau, welcome back to the show, because as I was saying to the viewers before, computers didn't like us particularly last time we spoke. Which is
I have gremlins.
Yeah, I don't know if it's you or me, because I could hear myself okay, but your voice was all distorted. So I don't know. I think computers just decided to have a bit of a meltdown and messed us up. So this is going to be a kind of strange interview because I already know what you're going to answer.
Here's hoping I do.
I'm sure you do. Come on. All right, let's begin for the very beginning again to people. So you've been designing RPGs and being an advocate for inclusivity, diversity, and safety for a while now. But tell me a little bit about your genesis. Where did you come from? How or why did you start to do all these things?
So I've been playing RPGs of various types for a really long time. I actually started out in text-based role-playing games online way back in the late 90s, early 2000s on forums. I was doing stuff like Harry Potter and Redwall and Lord of the Rings. Back when fanfic was like kind of the owner of the world. I even ran a website for a while where we had like our own Gringotts bank and like all this stuff. And it was really low mechanics, but very high role play. And sometimes didn't have mechanics at all. And I really loved that, and it was a huge part of my like teen years, and I did that up until I was an adult. And whenever I was a teenager, I met my now spouse, John W. Sheldon, who is also a game designer and layout artist and illustrator and all sorts of things. And he introduced me to more traditional games like Dungeons and Dragons and Shadowrun and Mutants and Masterminds. And what I discovered was that like I really did love a lot of the games and the mechanics, and I loved fiddling with mechanics, but I didn't like a lot of the culture around game. Because at the time I was presenting as a woman, I was younger. People tended to take advantage of me. Some of the groups we were in over the years were abusive or not very caring. And it was really difficult for me. And over time, we switched groups a couple of times, and I had a rather big blow up with a game friend about content that they wanted to include in their games. And that's when I discovered Gaming as Women. And started writing about like safety and content in games and the ability to say no to a session, to say no to a table. You know, that was like one of my first articles for Gaming as Women, what got me onto the team and writing for them before I came out as non-binary masculine. And basically saying things like, if someone has like content in a game, even if it's the only game available, it's still okay to say, hey, like, I don't want to play that. It's better to not play than to play something traumatic, right? And in my case, with the person in question, they wanted to include like sexual assault and rape as a backstory for orcs in their fantasy game, which is, for me personally, it's one of my personal like fits. Like, I hate it. I get very upset about it, and we had a huge blow up, and it ended up with me mostly like falling out of that friend group and moving into indie games more because I felt that they had more flexibility. And I still play trad games. Like Shadowrun 3rd edition is a really major game for me that I love a lot. But I play with safety tools that I designed, and I also like to play with curated groups, and I'm careful at conventions, and I also like to play a lot more indie games because I can kind of control them a little bit better than something with a billion mechanics.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned about the culture around games, because I find it a little bit of an oxymoron, if that's a paradox, because we're meant to be playing social games that people are meant to be having fun with. But as soon as somebody mentions, but this is not fun for me, there seems to be an awful lot of backlash against that. Why do you think that is?
I think that it's hard for people, especially people with privilege or who are used to having their perspective and their fun be the primary perspective and primary fun. It is hard for them to have someone question that and say, that's not my fun. And like, that perspective is not my perspective. And maybe we should change the way that we're looking at things to be more fair to people who are different. I know that in the experiences that I had whenever I was fighting with friends over those backgrounds, they didn't start taking me seriously at all about the content of the like fantasy world until I came out as a survivor of sexual assault. Up until then, my opinion that the content could upset someone, or it was tasteless or unnecessary or over the top or bigoted, was completely like ignorant to them. They didn't care. But whenever I was like, please, like, you need to understand, like, I've actually been assaulted, and like that's one of the many reasons why this is so problematic to me. And then they were like, oh, well, I didn't know that like you experienced that, so like maybe we can think about it a little bit harder, but I still think I want to include it. And I was like, I can't believe that that's like the only way you'd make any concession at all is to like think of me as like a victim and to have been directly affected by it. And it's because sometimes people just can't like wrap their heads around the fact that like someone can, one, care about people who may not be existing in the moment. Like I always like have in my head the idea of the like the invisible, like the invisible survivor or the invisible victim. Whenever you're at a game table, it's like, well, what if they were here? Like, so you're playing a game and you bring up a thing. It's just like, well, what if there was, you know, a person of color at the table when you bring up something racist? Like, what if there was, you know, a person who was Jewish when you bring up like tasteless Holocaust stuff? And, you know, pretend that that person is there, you know, have that invisible person whenever you ask these questions. And the people who don't want to like react to that, who don't want to have that conversation, are the same people who, when those people show up at the table, immediately balk at like any of their suggestions. They aren't willing to pretend that they're there. They aren't willing to imagine their existence because they also deny their personhood to a degree because they don't see them as real. They don't see them as valid unless they've suffered visibly to them. I was actually, this is a little bit of a tangent of something new from the last time we talked, but I was talking to my partner Thomas about Tomb Raider and how we only see women as valid heroes in media if they have suffered and been traumatized, right? And that's what they're doing with the modern Tomb Raider games, and I hate it super lots. And so that's basically what it is with like these people who reject like any kind of like respect for people who might have trauma or whatever. It's like, unless you've literally had that trauma in front of me and it's a trauma that I judge as valid, like, I don't care what you feel. Like, I don't care what you've experienced. It doesn't matter. And most of those people do have like, they are bigots. They are prejudiced. And that doesn't mean they're not salvageable or like someone we can kind of, you know, help to understand. But you have to like find the right angle to approach them and find a way to make them understand. And that can be very challenging to do, especially if they are someone who has been encouraged to respond with violence or anger. So it's like this hugely reactive kind of like put up a wall response. I think that it's very unhealthy for the community.
In the time that you have been working with this community and working to promote safety around the table, have you seen an improvement? Has it got worsened? Is it about the same? Where do you feel we are now compared with where we were as a community when you started?
I would say that there has definitely been improvements. For one, there's a lot more safety tools and content tools available. There's consent tools of multiple varieties. Like Kiana S on Twitter has, I cannot remember her like co-creator. they have the list of all of the different safety tools in the toolkit. And then there's stuff like script change, which I created, and the X card, which John Stavropoulos created, and everything. And having those accessible is already a huge step, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's that they're printable, that they're on Roll20, that they're on Discord. Those are already like huge steps, right? And that cons are more often having codes of conduct, and hiring safety coordinators and setting up those kinds of things to be more accessible and more accommodating for players of all kinds, and making sure that if someone does something that's harmful, they are, taken away from the situation and, made to change their behaviors before they can return. And like those things are like amazing. Those kinds of changes are just like, they're just great. They're so good to see. And I know that like some of this stuff just didn't exist at all whenever I started. Like I went to like a couple of cons whenever I first started, and there was no such thing as a code of conduct. So like, it was refreshing whenever I went to Big Bad Con the first year that I went, and they had like these giant codes of conduct for the community guidelines, like sitting on the entrance to like every game room, and like on the like sheets that you get at the like sign-in desk. And like it really is a culture there, and like Metatopia and similar double exposure cons also have a really big, emphasis on that kind of thing. And I think that my biggest concern that like we haven't seen change is that there's still a large allowance for harassing behaviors outside of game.
Mm-hmm.
Like long-term harassment of people who are creators or players in games. And we have issues with people who have stalked people and sexual harassment. I did a very extensive blog post that involved some research and interviews with people in the industry who had been basically experienced sexual harassment in the industry, and it led to the exposure of Matt McFarland and a couple of other things going on. And this was like 2 or 3 years ago, and the numbers and feedback I got were just horrific. And it's partially because we finally started to get safety like at the game table, right? Like at the little like white sheeted table we have in the middle of the conference room, but we aren't expanding that out to our, kind of communities where we play, and to our social media and our forums. And we aren't willing to say, hey, we're not saying that you can never like come back or something like that, but we are saying you need to stop doing what you're doing before you can participate again. Mm-hmm. And you need to change your behaviors and show that behavior has changed. And like, I mean, we've had huge harassment campaigns and threats and just like endless campaigns of harassment for some people. And it's terrifying to see that kind of thing happen, because what ends up happening is you'll find that people find ways to circumvent the policies at cons. We've had people get assaulted in hotel rooms and things like that. And we've had people show up to a table and like they'll be playing the game and following all the rules, but they'll turn out to be like someone that knows someone who's harassing them. And it's just all a big conspiracy. And it's exhausting to see that it's like that. But it's because we allow toxic bubbles to grow and kind of feed into each other. And often people are unwilling to take a stand and say, this kind of behavior is not okay. Like harassment should never be okay.
Absolutely.
Doxing should never be okay. Like those, it doesn't matter whether they're the good guys or the bad guys or whatever. It should never be acceptable under any circumstances. And the fact that we allow those things to happen and then encourage them or perpetuate them shows that we aren't actually understanding a culture of safety, because we're just basically slapping the safety tools on the cover. A lot of people talk about integrating safety tools into your game.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about integrating safety tools into your community and your experience, like your whole like communal play. And that's why I think that it's about more than just, you know, well, whenever we sit down to play, we all like listen to consent. And it's like, well, yes, but do you do that whenever you're not playing? And like, when are you planning to do that? Like, can we see that as a actual action? And are you continuing that when you log online and like share people's nudes and things like that? So I think that it is doing so much better in so many ways, right? But the world is a different landscape than it used to be. It's so much easier to do harmful things.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to make a concerted effort to fight the toxic behaviors and the cultural vengeance attitude that we tend to have as people, and try to basically like work on aiming for consent, respect, and a balance of order and, you know, forgiveness whenever people start to make changes to be better. So, yeah.
But there is also a danger, and this is something that we have also seen in the past. And I think that ties with what you were saying about a culture of safety and the fact that it should be for everybody. Because I have seen an awful lot of times when some people make stupid remark, they make a mistake, or they simply they hold some abhorrent ideas, which immediately can draw a huge amount of people on the good side to do exactly the same things to them that we don't want to have done to us.
Yeah.
Is there a solution for that? What should be the approach to that? Because I just said, harassment is no good, and although I understand it happening, I don't like the idea of harassing a perpetrator either. I think they should be dealt with differently.
I agree. Harassing perpetrators and like doxing perpetrators and stuff, I think is completely wrong, and I don't think that we should do it. And I think that a better solution is to instead use tools that are available that as our resources on social media sites and at cons and stuff like that, such as reporting tools and talking to con staff and, keeping record of what's going on without being like stalkery. So, report the thing, keep your report. Don't keep like screenshots of every activity. And then I think another thing that we need to really keep in mind whenever those things happen is we need to like kind of be willing to designate an active person to address situations instead of having 30 people go after a person. Like it's okay to like in a Slack be like, hey, who wants to be the person to monitor this right now and like talk to this person and have someone do that? Because first of all, that way you can identify someone who's currently stable and who's currently not overwhelmed and isn't necessarily the person who's being attacked by the perpetrator or dealing with the trauma that may be being referenced. And that way you can also designate someone who, can address the reporting and be consistently in contact with any sort of reporting authority. And And I think it's important to do that because we can communicate together. We can build together and work together as community whenever we do that. I don't think that it's okay to do things like, we had this issue where a whole bunch of people like DM'd people to like get them to basically like trigger them, to force them to publicly like call out a creator earlier in the past year. And then other people were like basically threatened and pushed to uncircle or unfollow that person, or like deal with consequences. And the person in question was getting harassed at the same time. And this kind of like dogpiling and like rapid, like, let's crush this person, let's completely immediately deplatform them, and like also like force people to deal with them and deal with traumatic stuff is not okay. You should not make people like deal with traumatic things. You should never force someone into a triggering context or force a person into a like traumatic or stressful conflict. It should always be basically like, hey, here's what's going on, option to get in with all the warnings ahead. And I think we should be more often like, whisper networks matter. Using them to address individuals who make smaller mistakes, especially, as opposed to someone who's like blatantly doing something violent or dangerous. If someone just is like kind of shitty on Twitter, just be like, hey, let's maybe like address this through using Twitter and like talk to the person directly and say, hey, maybe you shouldn't have done this. And if it perpetuates, like if it gets worse, then consider bringing in more people to like address it further. We don't have to have dog piles and threats, and generally don't threaten people should be a pretty big rule, because that actually can come back on you. And like, we don't want to have it become just like a legal game of like just suing each other back and forth and stuff over things. So I think a large part of it is we just need to communicate with each other when these things happen, to instead address things in an organized fashion and in a way that isn't just like piling onto people and like doing the things that we are mad at them for doing. Like, don't use the enemy's tools against them, because that's how you become the enemy. Like, it's just how it works.
Yes, no, I definitely agree with that. Let's talk thing about safety tools around the table. You have devised the script change, which is a slightly more complex tool than something like the X card. Why did you decide to create it and put it out there when there are so many other tools around already?
So, whenever I originally created script change, I created it in about 2013. I wrote it over the course of about a year before that. I had only used, I think, the X card and the O card and heard of lines and veils at that time. So there weren't actually that many safety tools back whenever I got started that I knew of anyway. And I had been working on a game that was kind of focused on 80s action movies vibe, like kind of like Sly Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of vibe. And I really wanted a safety tool that would integrate well into that, but then I could port into other games that were cinematic or not, and could easily be learned by anyone who could understand like some simple terminology. And I also wanted something that had more flexibility than the X card and also didn't call for a hard stop.
Okay.
Because some of my friends had kind of had a negative reaction to the like hard stop kind of thing of the X card. They were like, I don't really like that. And so I started out with pause, rewind, and fast forward. And so pause is like it's basically my safe word, and I use it for like basically everything. And I use it in and out of games in like my whole life. And in script change, it's used literally to just take a break where you can discuss the game, you can do a bio break, you can, just have a moment and like recover. It is literally a break in the game to do the things that you need to do. And you can also use the other tools while you're in a pause if you decide you want to like back up some content or whatever. But it's primarily just to get a break. And fast forward is a fade to black, because I have always wanted a fade to black in games. Because sometimes I want to fade to black an entire combat because I get tired. And as someone who has disabilities, a long combat in like D&D or something can get extremely boring. And sometimes it's very obvious how it's going to go. And I'm just like, can we just get to the end of it and like roll this out and be done? And so I also just wanted something to skip like gory scenes, or if people wanted to do sex scenes, especially because like once you play Monster Hearts, you're just kind of like, I don't want to see teenagers having sex, even like in fake. And so I was just like, fade to black, that's what I want. So that's where fast forward came from. And rewind is actually it's like a redo kind of, but it can be used a couple of different ways as of now in the text, because I have updated it since then. But its original form was you could just rewind the scene and you'd like back it up like on a VCR, and record over it basically.
Okay.
And replay the scene to do the new version of it. And it's kind of inspired loosely by Try a Different Way, by Archipelago, the game, which is a wonderful game. And that's one of my favorite cards in the game, because Try a Different Way is just a way to get like a better story, basically. And that's why I say script change is like a content tool as much as it is a safety tool, because it's about not just, protecting yourself and everything, but it's also about telling the best story you can, because the best story you can tell is actually typically the story that hurts the least. And so I started with those, and then later I built on a whole bunch of additional stuff like rap meetings, which are like debriefs, instant replays, which are just basically like, hey, look at that cool thing that just happened, which I like because it's fun. And there's frame by frame, which is like a slow-mo to like go through the scene and do checks for like people who are nervous about something that's happening or like difficult scenes. And I'm pretty sure I'm forgetting some of my own mechanics right now. But that's the general gist. It's a very like, it's supposed to be very flexible, and when people integrate it into their games, they can choose to like use some or all or like a different combination of the mechanics. They can reskin them to make sense. They can rewrite them. And I support people when they have done that for like a ton of different games. It's been integrated into like a huge number of games at this point. I wish I had a list, actually. But I did it because like there wasn't anything that did exactly what I wanted. And I am so picky. I'm like the pickiest person to play games with, because I have to do everything exactly the way I want to. And people can probably attest to this if they play with me at cons. Like, I set up my dice a special way. I like have to write out my character sheet in a specific order. Like, whenever I was designing Turn, the game that I recently kickstarted and released, I like the book had to be organized like perfectly and in detail with the poetry and everything. It's very precise. But like with script change, it was very much about being a tool that I could easily use and easily teach to people. because the teachability was essential. And I have yet to meet somebody who couldn't easily pick up script change. The terms are really recognizable, easy to remember, and they make sense whenever you think about them.
Mm-hmm.
And it also is kind of just, you start off using the tool by like making a list of things you want to include in your game and things you don't want to include for each session, and update it as you go, and do that for each game you play. And it has always been very successful when we've done that. And I also I recently used it for like one of the first times ever actively used it in a game.
Mm-hmm.
And it just like is so, it's such a smooth tool, like, because you have to say what you want to erase, which isn't the same with all tools. So I generally use rewind in the way that you redo the scene and that the thing goes away. Not that it's like a memory or a dream or whatever. And we were playing Sleepaway, and there was a scene where a kid was about to get killed, and I was just like, I don't know, we're gonna redo that. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't want to see this. And so I rewound it, and as soon as I said, hey, I'd like to rewind this, I don't want the kid to die, everyone in the whole table worked with me to give a new scene, just like automatically and smoothly, and there was no
drama,
like problems at all. So I think it is I think it's possibly my best design work.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think it is so accessible to people, and that's, to me, the most important part.
The thing I'm liking when I hear you talk about it, and obviously this is the second time that I hear you talk about it, but the thing I like about it is how I get the feeling that it renders itself very easily to be worked within the social construct, because I can imagine the rewind being treated differently in a D&D game than in a complete narrative, GM-less, dice-less sort of game, and needing a discussion as to how are we going to look after this particular thing, or are we going to use it at all? Maybe people will say, I don't want to use this in combats in D&D. The combat, once it's done, and if you die, you die. Or people may want to use it to, as a lifesaver for their character, what have you. I like how it renders itself to open the dialogue rather than say, this is it, take it or leave it. I think that's brilliant. The one thing, though, somebody was telling me, and this was very much to do with the X card than script change. Although I can imagine it can also be applied to script change if used in a convention where you're giving people, this is how this thing works, because there's no time, not for any other reason. And is that very often the people who are less able to use the tools are the ones who need it the most, because some people, when they witness something that is traumatic, they don't feel that they want to tap any cards because they don't want to be that person. How can that be addressed?
So I think this ties back to like kind of the culture of the community and of the conventions and everything like that. I explicitly point out in script change that it is okay for someone to tap a script change tool for someone else. And whenever I was studying leadership at Duquesne University, I was in my master's program, and I studied a lot about caring ethics. Mm-hmm. And I studied leadership for both my bachelor's and my master's, and of all the ethics, kind of ethical theories, caring ethics was the one that like really stuck with me the most, because even though it is primarily supposed to be applied to like medical professions and caregivers and things like that, if you expand it more broadly beyond that to the idea of like caring for and caring about people who are just everyday people that you see all the time, or people at your game table, or anything like that. If just people in general, not just people who are like under your care officially. And you try to kind of interpret that more to the experience of whenever you're at a game table, you're caring for each other as part of the experience. So you look at each other, and so say somebody at the beginning of the session says like that they're uncomfortable with certain kinds of stuff, but it gets brought up in the game anyway, and they're obviously upset, like visually they're giving body language that is very clear that they're uncomfortable. You are fine, so you tap the card for them, and you don't have to explain that it's for them. You can just say, hey, we said we were going to avoid this, and you skip over the content and you don't use it, and it's fine. And it's partially like learning to like care about the fact that like everyone is kind of part of a group as soon as they sit down at the game table. Like we all like to think of ourselves as like individuals, like especially in the US, like we're really bad about it. Like we're like we're individuals. We don't have to be like protected or anything. But like I have a useless panic response. When I panic, I freeze. I do not recommend this panic response when driving and hearing sirens, or in any other situation, really. But one time I was playing a really wonderful game of Black Stars Rise, run by Strash Ashimovic, with my spouse, John. And we were playing at like 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was really super spooky. And in the game, Strash, not knowing that asylum environments were one of my particular content triggers, trauma triggers, he like just kind of waltzed us right into one, like very suddenly. And I froze, like stock still, head to toe, and couldn't communicate to anyone that I was not okay. And John looked over and saw me and just like looked at my eyes and then looked at the tools and tapped the X card that we had at the time. And he just said, you know, skip the asylums. And so we did. And I was able to recover after that. It just took a few minutes. And since I was the one who had requested the game, it was really nice because I actually got to continue enjoying the game. And all it took was like John having the vaguest attention to the fact that I was obviously uncomfortable and not enjoying that part of the game, and to say, hey, you know, that's not okay. But we also need to like normalize like checking in with each other and like body language reading and stuff like that. Like, so if somebody looks uncomfortable or looks unhappy, like see if they're okay. Just be like, there's the okay check-in tool that I think is really, really great. It's one of the best safety tools out there. Everyone should like get used to using that. And like buddies, having a buddy whenever, if you're the kind of person who's not comfortable using safety tools, get a buddy, inform them of all your like major stuff. And, you know, have that whenever you try and get into the same games, and use that to like protect yourself. I think that we need to become like, as a community, like more willing to emphasize, you know, use these tools and everything, like at some of the cons, like at like I know like Dreamation, Metatopia, and I know Big Bad Con all have like the tools like right out on the tables and everything. I think we need to do more comprehensive explanations of what they are. All the GMs should be educated on using them, and if GMs refuse to use them, they should not be able to run.
Agreed.
Because it's the safety of the players that matters. And that should come first. Like, they shouldn't have to use every safety tool, but they should at least use one. And I say that because I don't care how good of a GM you are, you can still miss stuff.
Yes.
And GMs should also be willing to use safety tools. If they notice that a player looks uncomfortable and notice that they screwed up, X-card yourself. Yes. Like, just be like, hey, I screwed up. Let's move on. Because it's not a bad thing to do that. Like, it teaches people that you can always use the tools. So I think a large part of it is like changing the culture and like listening to each other, looking to each other, doing things to support each other as a group. Even if we're strangers, we can learn how to recognize people's needs and discomfort and like what it is when someone needs to be supported. But also, like, I think the conventions and like environments that we are in need to have the tools available. They need to have them educated about. So like, you need to be able to get pamphlets, you need to be able to get briefings at the beginning of the cons, including panels and stuff like that. And I also think that there should always be a requirement to briefly explain the tool at the beginning of every game. I know that we all have limited time, but briefly explaining it and encouraging use of them is the only way to get people to actually use them.
And it's interesting because even the mere presence of the tool already changes a little bit the dynamics of the group and around the table, even if it is not necessary. And sometimes just the mere presence of it makes people aware enough that they wouldn't do things that otherwise might have been problematic for somebody else just by being there.
Yeah, so John is designing a game called Roar of Alliance, which is a World War II tank game where you're a crew of tank crew. And he has like a game board for it where you like place your tanks on and everything. And he actually put script change into the board. It's like a part of it. And whenever he took it to conventions, we actually had a couple of players who were like, if that hadn't been there, like, I don't know if I would have felt comfortable, like, actually doing some of the stuff in the game that we did, because, like, I knew that, like, it was integral and, like, it was going to be listened to and, like, accepted whenever I use the tool, because it's a part of the game. And that actually was really interesting to me, that people, like, saw it as like an integral tool because it was a part of the board and recognized that it was like going to be respected. So I thought that was really great.
There are a couple of games. There is another a role-playing game called Untold Adventures Await, an Irish, which for me is the most perfectest role-playing game to introduce people with, because it uses Rory story cubes as a means to create the story, and it has a script change embedded into the board itself, where people can pause, play, and can rewind with their own cards. It's absolutely,
I love that so much.
It's absolutely unbelievable. The whole thing is truly, truly wonderful. Right, to wrap it up, because we've been at it again for quite some while, which is amazing. Just one last thing. We both know that there are an awful lot of people out there who are like, no safety tool. If you cannot take this, you shouldn't play role-playing games. Just go away. It's a bit, Jesus, you're scary. What would you say to those people regarding safety tools around the table?
If you can't be nice to people, don't play games. I mean, that's the simple gist of it. Like, games are a social activity primarily. Like, play some solo games or, like, get used to it. Respect people's boundaries, respect people's consent, be safe, and, like, let people tell the stories they want to tell by using these tools. Or don't play with people, because those days are over, man.
Yeah. I made a podcast episode about this while ago now, a couple of years ago, and I ended up the episode saying, please find another hobby. Just yeah. go away. I would just go away. Bo, thank you seriously so much for coming back and being with me today, because once again, it's been an absolutely brilliant experience, and I wish we had hours and hours and hours to keep talking about this and many other things, because it's fantastic to have you around. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really, really wonderful, and this has been a wonderful interview. And I wish we had the responses from last time, but like this was like so cool to kind of get to like go through again and like
just chilling.
Feel like a special cool person.
You are. You very much are. So yeah, absolutely yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for listening and watching. If you've been watching, it is genuinely appreciated. I'd love to hear what you have to say. It's always refreshing to be able to talk to you about this. So please leave me your comments if you're watching the video, and join the conversation in our Facebook page, and get in touch in Twitter as well, where I am at GMS Magazine. It would be fantastic to hear if you've used script change, when, how, why, if possible, you've used it, and see if you've changed anything as well, because this is a tool that can change over time to meet specific requirements, and that is really, really exciting. And if you disagree with this tool, please let me know. Why do you disagree with the script change? Why do you disagree with using it? Because disagreeable as it might be, I still find it fascinating the reasons people give. So do stay in touch, and I very much look forward to having a chat with you about it. But until the next time, thank you once again for watching or listening, or both. And until the next time, I will talk to you very, very soon. Take care.